All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Brent is joining us here from St. Louis hotel room. Tonight's seminar is when to fix or replace those bricks. We have a lot of people signed up tonight, so I know you're going to keep joining us. I'll try to repeat how things are going to work a couple quick times before we get started tonight. This is being recorded, so everybody knows. You can go back and look at this later on if you miss anything or you don't feel like frantically taking notes. No worries, you can find it through our Facebook page. You can also get it through our website. Also, anybody who signed up tonight is going to get an email at the end of this. It's going to have resources, any resources that we mentioned tonight, and also a link to the recording. So that's another way to find it. We are going to Brent and a guest speaker friend of his are going to speak tonight for around 45 minutes or so. And whenever they wrap up, we're going to have 15 minutes of questions at the very end. So if you have questions along the way, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't use the chat. We're actually not utilizing that for this, but the Q&A at the bottom is what you're going to want to use. He's probably going to answer a lot of your questions along the way too, so you might want to hang out a little bit and wait before you do that. But that's kind of how we're going to do things. So again, for folks who just joined, we are recording tonight. We'll have this available after tonight's lecture as well, and we'll send out an email with that link too. So just to get started here, I wanted to introduce Brent, who was kind enough to speak with us tonight. Brent Schmidt is the Vice President and Architectural Sales Manager of Bricks Incorporated. As a lifelong brickophile and the day-to-day leader of a 45-plus-year-old small business, Brent hustles to create and nurture client relationships built upon trust, experience, and quality materials. When he's not out visiting job sites, biking to work, or sending a flurry of emails, Brent acts as a sales team captain, workplace polyglot, dog whisperer, showroom curator, part-time barista, and occasional janitor. Thank you so much, Brent. I will send this over to you. Again, to everyone who's watching, we are recording this, and we'll get you the link and everything afterwards as well. Please put your questions in the Q&A, which we'll do at the very end. All right, without further ado, feel free to take over, Brent.
Okay, cool. So thanks for the nice intro. Barista, that's accurate. Had to learn how to use the espresso machine at the shop. So what I'll do is I'll just share quickly a little bit about our company, show you the website, and then we'll get after it. So Carla, if you just want to give me a thumbs up when you can see my screen. And are we good to go? All right, cool. So we'll kick it off. So we're Bricks Incorporated. When you have an almost 50-year-old company, you can pick out a name that didn't exist about 50 years ago, and it's a very easy name to remember. So we're a family-owned company. We're in Little Village. Just to show you where we're at, guys. So the Monadnock building, which is where Chicago Bungalow Association is headquartered out of. Here's the Loop, and then we're right here, 34th and Kedzie. If you're not familiar, Little Village is technically North Lawndale, I believe, but Little Village is the home of Bricks Incorporated, right on the I&M Shipping Canal, and we're happy to be here tonight. We support Chicago Bungalow Association, and we'd like to kick it off by teaching you about when it's appropriate in terms of time to fix those bricks or say goodbye and start over. So, Brick 101 for historic homeowners is what we've titled this slideshow. I could not have presented this without my colleague, Patty Swanson. She runs our Instagram, so if you want to find us on there and learn a little bit about both new construction and restoration in and about the city, I would suggest you check us out on Instagram, and it's Bricks Inc. Chicago is our handle, so check it out. So a little bit about our history. We're a Chicago-based firm, still family-owned. There's only a couple of brick vendors, if you will, in the city, and we're the only family-owned one. So in 1968, our company started more so as a demolition company, where we would tear down buildings, actually during some of the civil unrest in the 60s, some of the riots and whatnot, and we would get contracts where we would tear down an old building and salvage the terracotta, the brick, the stone, things that were being torn off of the old buildings, and instead of going into the waste stream, we would salvage those products and find homes for them. So in 1978, we actually incorporated under Bricks Incorporated. And a year later, we started carrying new bricks, products that were made in relevantly recent times from the 70s and forward. We also have a third partner company that is housed out of our Chicago office called Fenestration Solutions, where we do a lot of historic preservation window products. And we've been doing windows for close to 40 years at this point. So we welcome you guys down to Little Village. If you want to check us out, you're welcome to come by. Normal weekday hours and then Saturdays by appointment. So let's kick it off with reclaimed brick. Everybody knows what a Chicago Common looks like, but it's not as easy as you might think. There's a little bit of history that we'll touch on this afternoon. So the typical Chicago Common factories started in the early 1800s, and they ran all the way through into the 1970s when the EPA essentially killed the Chicago brick factories. So the image on the right, those are our stackers, and the guys in the field will go out as the buildings are being demoed, and the demolition contractors will connect with our team and state, hey, we've got a project coming down at such and such location. We think there's a value to it, and then we'll send one of our people to go determine what the color is. And if it's a color that's worth salvaging, we'll go ahead and make a contract, and we'll start to stack up the material on the skids like you see on the right. I don't know if you guys are familiar with our friend brickofchicago.com. He's Insta famous, and then also he has a pretty solid website that talks to you about the different types of bricks around Chicago. But if you're not familiar with Will Quam, Brick of Chicago, he does some pretty awesome tours around the city. So check out his website. It's pretty great. So usually Chicago Commons are not the facade of the building. They may be, and in recent times, we've been doing a lot of single family homes or retail establishments that use Chicago Commons, but typically you'll consider Chicago Commons sort of a commodity product. You'll see this on the sides and rear of factories, of sometimes schools, certainly bungalows will be down the sides and rear, but Chicago Commons are this warm pinkish tonality. Typically, you'll see multiple colors on one project. It's not a static color. So when we talk about salvaging brick, we as a company don't only seek out the exterior wythe, and you can see this little axiom view here. A wythe is the first wythe, the second wythe, and the third wythe in this case. Typically, you'll have multiple wythes on a common bond brick or a mass wall, as it's called. So a course, you'll have the first course, the second course, and as you run vertically on the building, that's called a course of brick as you run up. But the wythe, spelled with a Y, is from the face to the second course to the third. And in the Monadnock building, they have multiple wythes, multiple feet deep of brick. So 20 to 30% of this brick, as we're demoing the building or the demo contractor is doing that, we're going to lose it. So unfortunately, the brick will go in a landfill somewhere or be crushed as road base or, find a new home for it if we can. But the typical coloration is actually not just a pink color. Everyone thinks that Chicago Commons are a medium pink or a dirty pink, but really that's not true. So the Commons that you see on your screen here, with exception of the two in the bottom right-hand corner, which are granite street pavers and clay street pavers, those are all considered common brick. There's Philly Commons, New York Commons, all sorts like that. But everything you see on the screen comes within about 150 mile radius of Chicago. On my house, I live in Portage Park. I've got sand buffs, so the bottom left-hand corner. But there's a new precedent that's being set probably in the last 10, 15 years where people will use Chicago common brick and create new structures. So here's a home on Winchester, just south of the 606. There's a nice pink, a little bit of range to it. What's very popular also is exposed brick on the interior of a building as a feature wall. On the right-hand side, there's a really cool building on 2100 block of Damon on the west-hand side. There's a interior designer studio guild in the first floor. On the left-hand side, you get a fireplace for a project that's over in Indiana. homeowner moved over to Indiana and wanted to take a piece of Chicago with her. So that's why you have something like that on the fireplace. So common issues, of course, the pun intended. Efflorescence. I think you guys have had some seminars done before as to why water-soluble salts are present on the face of the brick, whether it be the exterior face on the outside of the building or on the inside of your condo building if you've got exposed commons or exposed brick on the interior. Everybody's probably familiar with efflorescence. 50% of people can pronounce efflorescence, but essentially what it is it's a water-soluble salt that drives its way to the face of the brick or the mortar joint or the stone or whatever masonry assembly component you're looking at. And this water-soluble salt presents itself where it dries out. So in this case, you can see on that mass wall that's off to the right, pooling of salts that are occurring at different locations. Typically what this means is moisture penetration is occurring at the cap or at a punched opening, a flashing contingency that is not done properly, or a roof membrane that's faulty. And what has happened is you're driving moisture into this wall and you see salt where it's dried out. So when is it okay? It actually is okay, and it's to be expected when you have what's called new building bloom. So here's a condo building, maybe a 3-flat. I'm not sure what this project is, but on this component here, this spandrel that's running across in this column, you can see this utility size brick, or yeah, it looks like a utility size brick because it's in utility third bond. You can see that it's presenting a lot of salt in this area. So that's okay, and you can probably expect to see that for 1 to 2 seasons as that wall assembly is drying out. Typically, you can brush that off. What we would not advocate for is sealing the brick. We'll get to that in a little bit, but sealants are not necessarily friends of masonry. So it's okay during new building bloom, we'll call it. When is it a problem? When you see moisture penetration and presentation of efflorescence on the exterior or interior of the building, what that means is you're going to have moisture pouring into that wall. In this case, it's very likely occurring at the sill of the window. There's probably no flashing beneath it, or if it is, it's faulty. Perhaps you don't have end dams at the jamb in the corner of the windowsill and the vertical jamb as it's running up. Where you see a lot of water efflorescence and typically freeze thaw and spalling, that's where you want to be talking to a qualified mason subcontractor, tuck pointer, restoration mason. And what they can do is they can inspect to see if there's baccarat and sealant, caulk, different conditions that typically over the life of a building need to be inspected and repaired. And I think at the end of this, we'll be able to share some suggestions as to how to qualify a mason subcontractor or a building inspector who's capable of making those determinations. But basically, if you continue to see salt, something's probably going on with your wall assembly. Painted brick. We all either love or hate HGTV, I imagine. This little section, we'd like to talk about what happens when you actually do paint brick. So on the left-hand side, this is a zoomed in version of what's happening on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we've got a Chicago Common. The challenge with Chicago Commons is that they have a pretty high porosity. And what that means is it absorbs a lot of water. It's somewhat like a sponge. Not so much as, say, a concrete masonry unit or concrete block. Some people used to call them cinder blocks. But what's happening is you are absorbing moisture. And whether that moisture is water or a latex paint or an acrylic paint or a stain or a breathable sealant, it's going to get sucked into the face of the brick and eventually penetrate those little tiny microscopic pores. That's actually what causes the mortar to bond to the brick by capillary action, and it's gluing the mortar to the brick. So on the right-hand side, what we see is it's probably an acrylic or perhaps a latex-based paint. So what's happening there is moisture is getting into that wall assembly. It could be happening from much further up where you've got a parapet or a punched opening that's directly above this. But what's happened is moisture is able to travel into that masonry assembly whether it's the mortar joint, a little crack in the brick, whatever it might be. The problem is it's not able to get out. So what happens is when you create ice, ice will expand to a size that's larger than the liquid format of water. And what it's done is it's actually pushed the face of the brick off. If you guys aren't familiar with this, it's called spalling. Definitely at the point where you see spalling occurring on your brick, there's cause for concern, and it's pretty difficult to fix once the faces start spalling or popping off. So brick likes to breathe, mainly on the bungalows that we see, around the city. Let's say anything from late 1800s for a workers' cottage, all the way into the 40s and 50s for a multi-white masonry wall assembly. You're not going to see on the right-hand side of the screen that wall section. What that's showing you is a cavity wall. So a cavity wall started coming into play, say 1950s and forward. But prior to that, with bungalows, worker cottages, factories, anything that had a multi-wide masonry wall, we have what's called a mass wall. So like you see in the center image where you have water showing where it's wicking like a paper towel, sucking up into the masonry assembly. What's happening is the brick is sucking in moisture. And the challenge with that is if it's not able to breathe or push that moisture out through the face, what happens is it starts to expand in the wall assembly. And then either the mortar joint's going to fail, the stone, the masonry, the brick, something's going to fail as it starts to expand. So on the left-hand side, bottom left-hand side, there's a little section view of 4 typical masonry joints. So the most popular and the most typical for a Chicago common brick wall is going to be called a flush joint. So what the mason subcontractor has done is they've essentially buttered the bottom of the brick, laid the brick, and they take their trowel and they cut off the excess. So that's not as good at shedding water as the one that's directly above it. That's called the concave joint, where an S joiner tool or a sled runner, which is a type of tool like a long, it looks like a long bar, like a giant piece of conduit that's been shaved down and has a little handle on it. That's the concave joint. You'll see things like the extruded joint or the weeping joint at the top left. And then the raked joint, if you're all familiar with the Roby House or anything that was done at the time of Frank Lloyd Wright being popular, is they would actually rake the mortar back, and that's called a raked joint. That's in the bottom left. So extruded doesn't really shed water. It actually asks for water to enter at that point. Concave joint is really good for shedding water because you've actually put in compression that mortar joint. Flush joint is okay, but certainly not as good at shedding as the concave. And raked, although we have projects that haven't been tuck pointed in 30, 40, 50 years that have raked joints, the International Masonry Institute, the IMI, which is kind of not the governing body, but one of the consortiums that looks to educate and train the bricklayers and allied craftsmen, local 21 union bricklayers, they would say that the rake joint is going to have a lesser lifespan than the concave joint. So hopefully that makes sense. On the top right-hand side, we're seeing what's called a cavity wall, and that's generally the consensus as to how masonry walls are built, at least within the last 30, 40 years. It's essentially a rain screen. So paint traps moisture. I can't stress this enough, guys. Please don't paint your brick. HGTV likes to advocate for, latex-based paints or stains and whatnot. We understand that it's a thing. Just be very cautious. It has to have an extremely high permeability or perm rate in order to allow moisture to slip back out of that masonry assembly. So when wintertime occurs, you're going to see spalling because the faces start to pop. So if you look down the bungalows, a lot of times, not just the paint, but you'll see parging that has happened on the side of the building that's maybe 3 or 4 feet high. And what's happened is they've parged it, they've used stucco, they've used excess mortar, and essentially they've got a 1 to 2 inch coating that runs down the side of the building and towards the rear. The challenge is that actually traps the moisture. So it's doing the same thing that the paint's doing. And you'll start to see if you were to peel back that exterior shell, you'd start to see that the interior white, which is on the exterior of the building, is starting to decay. So can you remove paint? Absolutely, you can remove paint. Just realize that Many times what happens is if you do remove the paint, you're using an aggressive chemical in order to strip the paint off the exterior. And there's multiple manufacturers. There's Prosoco, EcoChem, Dietrich. There's a bunch of cleaners that you can purchase that would be able to remove paint. You just have to be cautious. Am I using a wand on a pressure washer with heat that's extremely close to the brick? That's potentially going to damage the face brick and the mortar that's on the exterior of your building. Paint alternatives. This is a very popular topic and has been for probably the past 15 or so years. Masonry stains, there's a company we work with that's called Masonry Cosmetic out of Indiana, and they use a soluble pigment in a medium that will actually be allowed to breathe. So you'll see a little before and after image on the right-hand side over here. So what's happened is they've color corrected to put this infill back to the way it would have looked had the building been originally that same color brick. So finding the right texture, color, and size are the first steps. And then someone who does masonry staining with a permeable product would be able to color correct. Lime wash, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's crushed little tiny, essentially dust that's mixed into a water as your medium, and then that's essentially rolled or painted onto the masonry or whatever you'd like to paint it on. It could be on siding or some other component, but basically what's happened is you've got crushed limestone, and this is in a medium that's then slurried onto the outside of a building. That's a living stain or a living lime wash, where over time at downspouts, scuppers, areas where this lime wash is going to take on water, it'll start to dissipate over the course of the life of the product. Poor tuck pointing. You guys have seen the the Chicago schmear, as I call it, or the German schmear. Some people have said it is. I can assure you that it's not the best for masonry assemblies. So on the left-hand side, just to point out the color of the common brick, this is what we would consider a clay buff. And the clay buff originated close to Fort Sheridan. So if you guys go Highland Park, North Side, that area, you'll see a lot of this yellow tonality brick. So what you see here is you've probably got a mason subcontractor or handyman person who has tried to do their best to tuck point these joints. But really what's happened is they probably used a mortar that was harder than it should have been. And by that, I mean, there's multiple types of mortar. There's type S, there's type N, there's type O, there's a bunch of different types of mortar. So as you're qualifying a mason subcontractor, not only do you ask them for past projects and referrals and whatnot, but some caution and some diligence should be done about qualifying what sort of mortar they'll be using. Could be a lime putty mortar, could be a different sort that you need to be educated about. So if we want to delve into that, we can do that in the Q&A. On the right-hand side, this is just a hot mess. So essentially, these are probably Philly Commons or St. Louis Commons where they have a reddish tonality. And the mason subcontractor or whomever's performed this work has essentially over-grouted the joints. And that's what you have on the right-hand side. So bad tuck pointing, again, they'll use typically a single or double edge grinding blade on their hopefully bagged equipment so that they're not having particulates floating all around in the air and respirating them. But what's happening is you need to grind out the joints, both the bed joint, which is the horizontal joint, and the head joint, which is the vertical joint, without deteriorating the brick. So if your mortar joint is currently is a 3/8 inch joint, you don't want to have your mason subcontractor grinding a 1/2 inch joint and destroying the brick and making the mortar joint much larger. You want to stay consistent with what it is. On the right-hand side, again, another hot mess where the mason subcontractor has done a pretty big disservice to what the original masonry had on it. What does bad pointing cause? What it causes is a couple things. So the brick can actually suffer. The mortar that is actually bonding your brick together for the 3 inches that are behind the new tuck pointing campaign, that can be disturbed. What you see here is these are Chicago common brick that the faces had already started to spall and to pop off the face of the building. And then you see a campaign of brick right here. Pardon me, a campaign of mortar that has this bulbous convex joint. This is probably a mortar that's too hard for the brick. So this is probably a lime putty mortar back here, which is the original. And then you've got this fairly ugly joint that's occurring here. And what that's caused is the brick to actually suffer, and then the entire masonry assembly is having problems with absorbing moisture. Now, good tuck pointing, or repointing as it were, should be something that's done by a qualified mason subcontractor. We service the market with a number of different subs that we feel are pretty competent and have a long track record. So asking your mason subcontractor to provide you with addresses, homeowners, businesses that have used their services, I think would be one of the main qualifiers. And then, a proper proposal is something that needs to be not a single Word document that just says, I'm going to do a great job at tuck pointing your house and here's the final price. Needs to be pretty diligent. So we can help walk you guys through that if that's something that you need. We don't do any actual work. Essentially, we are a material supplier. So if you guys want to talk about that further, I'm sure we can sidebar. But good tuck pointing, you'll notice here this is a concave joint. This is a concave joint. That's the best for shedding water, as we talked about before. And what you'll notice is the brick is not damaged. So you don't see a grinder blade that's chopped into the brick below where this head joint has occurred. You don't see a big chop mark in the brick here at the joint above. Those are things you want to look for. So repairs to masonry, which is a heavy portion of what we're talking about today. Some of these are going to be pretty self-evident where it's a no-brainer, but things to look for are spalling, mortar joints popping off the face, a lack of through wall flashing, and we can talk about through wall flashing in a little while, no problem. In this case, we have a limestone header instead of a steel lintel, which is carrying the weight of the masonry above. And typically you're going to see where at a 45-degree angle approximately above the window or the punched opening, you'll start to see a crack. In this case, this could have been movement in the foundation or some other such reason, but in this instance, a spot replacement of the bricks shown here, and understanding why this crack is occurring, this is definitely replacement time. So the challenge with replacement of product is finding a material that's going to match in terms of color, size, texture. All of these things are going to become important, and the challenge a lot of times is having a quantity that's sufficient to make it a project that a supplier would be able to help you with. So for example, a lot of times the contractor will come in and say, I need 10 bricks. It's a custom size, custom color, and I need it tomorrow. So I would say if you've engaged an architect or you've engaged an engineer, typically they'll reach out a lot earlier in the process. But oftentimes the mason subcontractor either doesn't have the foresight to do that, or perhaps they don't have the resources. They don't know where to look. So start on our website. It's a pretty helpful resource. On the right-hand side, it shows you all the different textures that exist. And, like the bungalows that I live nearby in Portage Park have smooth on two ends and then a vertical scratch in the center. So there are some hybrids. Like on the right-hand side of the page, you can see there's the smooth texture, which is, pretty obvious. It's very popular. But then you'll have the vertical scratch, the heavy scratch, the bark texture, all these different options that are available. And the challenge is not every manufacturer is still in business. So our industry in the past, even 20 years, has really consolidated where bigger manufacturers buy out the small guys and they either discontinue product or they destroy what the lineup was, so that if it wasn't something that was overly popular, they get rid of it. The next thing that's difficult is the color range. So understanding that, your yellow brick is a yellow brick might be something that we can't source anymore. So you've got to make sure that you can obtain a single loose piece, get some images to your supplier, whether it be the sales rep, the mason subcontractor, and essentially you try to spell out what it is that you're looking for. So if it's a Pantone color or Sherwin-Williams color that you can help hold up to it, that's great. But ultimately, grabbing one brick out of the wall, that's the most important thing that you can offer your supplier. How many bricks do you need? Sounds like a pretty obvious question, but the challenge becomes on a lot of the old brick, what would typically be considered a quote unquote standard size is no longer a size that's popular. So pre-1970s, the BIA, which is the Brick Industry Association, really didn't govern the size of extrusions or molds. So a lot of times, your house in Portage Park versus your house in Berwyn, one person might say it's a standard size brick, it'd be 8 inches long. And then the other person might be at 8 1/4, and that's considered a standard size. So there's 3 dimensions that your supplier would need to know: your depth, that's into the wall, your height, which is the vertical, and then the length. So those 3 dimensions are really important. And then nominally, there's about 7 bricks per square foot for the houses that we're talking about today. So if you've got a run of wall that's 4 feet tall and 40 feet long, multiply that by 7, and that's how many bricks you're going to need. Obviously, you don't want to be liable for pinning that number down. So make sure your mason subcontractor is willing to work with you on determining the quantities that they need for your project. Typically, I would say that quantities under 500 pieces, which is something that would be considered a cube of brick or a skid or a pallet. Those are typically, you're going to have to go to your local brickyard, bring a few pieces of the brick that you're looking to match, and then essentially present that as what your best goal is. Quantities over 500 pieces, a lot of times you'll have to be able to check a manufacturer. Back in the day, when I started doing this 15, 20 years ago, there were maybe 300 brick manufacturers. There's probably more like 200 brick manufacturers now. And a lot of those are owned by some of the big organizations out of Australia. Austria is another big company that owns maybe 30 plants. So there's a lot of consolidation that's occurred. So in the image on the right-hand side, this is just pointing out the fact that sometimes the manufacturers didn't have a real tight control on their colors or their flashing patterns. So you can see these little hearts, these little crossettes, these odd little striations that are occurring on the brick. So modern manufacturers will do that, but they might not have the extreme diversity that you see on this wall that's in the background. So in the foreground, you've got a sample that was put together by Patty, one of my colleagues, and she's essentially taken 3 different manufacturers and blended them together at percentages that she felt were appropriate. Now, in this case, this was a school. It's not an actual bungalow or a single family home, but sometimes that's the only way to do it is by blending components together. Landmarks is pretty strict. So if your property is landmarked, I would definitely say that upon purchasing it or upon considering purchasing it, make sure you know whether or not this house is a landmark. So to wrap it up and put a bow on it, Bricks Incorporated, we're a family-owned business in Chicago. We've got offices in Milwaukee, Aurora, and Chicago. And a lot of the other stuff that we carry, you can see on our website and also through our social media. But masonry is kind of having a great revival in the past 10, 15 years where there are a lot of new buildings that are coming up where you can see masonry as a product where you wouldn't think of it formerly as something that could be a brick wall. So if you want to check out our socials, check them out. We've got dogs on our website. We're able to come down to the warehouse if you like to see some old scary buildings and a lot of cool samples in the showroom. So thanks for making time for me, guys. I'm not sure what the format is next, but I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Hi, Brent. Thanks. Did you say you had a homeowner that was going to speak, or are we just going to questions?
I got a message during that that said won't be able to make it. So
okay, got it. Okay, I just want to make sure before we jump in. One thing I just wanted to revisit really quickly that you had mentioned was parging. I'm not sure that everybody knows the term parging, and you sort of described it, but it is really common, and it's a thing that I'm hyper aware of as well. I just want to make sure people are clear about it's basically like smearing cement at the base of your building. People often do it along the sides of their building because water is being absorbed in the base, right? So, yeah, if we could just point that out again, it's just so common. And it
So this
drives
is
me
what
a
you
little
want
bit bonkers.
to, this is what you want to not do.
Right, right. And I know it looks like a quick, clean way to sort of deal with things, but it's really destroying the brick at a much quicker rate now underneath there. So, and you can't take that stuff off without it really kind of destroying stuff. So I just wanted to revisit that point. I don't think folks often hear the term parging, unless you're sort of involved more in the actual business of things. So, um, oh, we're doing more parging there, right?
Yep, sorry about that. I'm
Okay,
feeling
no,
you.
that's
Finding
fine.
clarity.
No, that's fine. And I also just wanted to make the point really quick. We have really great questions too, so I'll get to those in a second, just because we have an extra minute though. When you say landmark property, I just want to make sure folks know we have thousands of buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Those are not held to the standards that local landmark property is, which is where you're, talking about where there's all of these design guidelines and permissions that you need. So I just don't want people to worry if they've done some repointing that they're going to be in trouble or there's some consequence to that. If you're listed in one of our National Register districts, you don't have to worry about that. It's yes, of course, these are best practices and we love that, but there's a lot of homes listed on there. So it's a little bit of a different animal. You don't have the same criteria. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. But let's take a look at, again, somebody asked us as well, how they can share this presentation and go back and watch it. If you signed up tonight, we're going to send you an email out with a link to this, but also it lives on our Facebook page if you want to check us out on Facebook and on our website. So you can look at all of our past webinars on there. They've all been recorded since we started doing these during the pandemic. So yeah, you can always go to that. Okay, let's get into the Q&A though. Okay, this was something you brought up a little before the presentation, Brent. Can Bricks Incorporated do an assessment and come out and look at people's homes to see what needs to be done?
So what we typically, I think that one's coming from Daryl. Basically what would end up happening is we would usually engage a mason subcontractor to have them swing by, take a look at it. What I would say, Daryl, is we can provide our contact information through Carla, and you're welcome to do the following. I would take a picture from 2 feet away and 10 feet away of the condition that you're concerned about. And 9 times out of 10, I can tell you what's happening on there. We're not a subcontractor. We don't supply any labor. So essentially I could tell you, hey, if you're going to qualify a mason subcontractor, here are 5 or 6 people you might want to talk to, and they're probably going to come back with similar input from us, being that we've been doing it a long while. But to ascertain what's really happening with your project, you need a qualified subcontractor, but images would help, and we can tell you where to start from there.
And I know that there already were a couple of questions in here, and I'm guessing more now will come in asking, well, who are these subcontractors that are actually qualified? Right. So one thing is we do have a list, just so you all know, on our website of contractors who have been recommended by at least 3 of our members. So we have a list there in our trusted referrals page, but also, Brent, if you'd like to. You also had mentioned that you have resources as well that subcontractors that you could recommend. So so we can send that out as well in the follow-up email to this for you guys.
Sure. While you're looking, what I'm going to do is I would recommend, if you're ever going to do an addition on a home or do any sort of work, I would say that cleaning the masonry is extremely important. So if I can steal the screen just for a minute, I'll show you, we're working on the Lathrop Homes project at, Clybourne and Diversity. Mm-hmm. And so I'll bring up some images. A lot of times, especially when it's a landmark, this portion of the building off to the left-hand side, this is the original brick. And then this is the new construction brick that was done as an in situ mock-up with the limestone coping and the flashing and whatnot. But what you want to make sure that you do is clean with a detergent and a chemical the existing masonry if you're ever going to do any work. The challenge is if we match a dirty brick and we put it in the wall, and then you have the budget 5 years later to wash the building, the new brick and the old brick, they're not going to match. So that would be just something that I would point out, is understanding what chemicals do to your building and how to properly make sure that you're washing it down. And just as an aside, this is a ground out joint where the brick has been saved and is in good condition, but essentially they've ground out the first, say, half-inch of mortar, both vertically and into the bed of the brick. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and if you want to.
No, it's great to see. It's great to see images like that. It's really helpful, I think, for everybody. Okay. Most of these we can just sort of go in order, I think. My house, Carlos says, my house is located on a busy street and my beige colored brick is discolored with pollutants and mildew and grime. I've attempted to power wash it, but was unable to remove and clean it. What do you recommend to clean this exterior brick? I hear muriatic acid can work, but it's not recommended.
Yeah, so if the property is a landmarked project, a lot of times Chicago Landmarks or SHPA, which is State Historic Preservation, they have certain guidelines as to what you can and cannot use to clean the existing masonry. We kind of joke in the office, you know, lemon water is basically the most harsh chemical that you're allowed to use, but that's not really going to do too much. But there are manufacturers like Prosoco, for example, EcoChem. There are different manufacturers out there that make detergents that are gentle enough to effectively remove both new masonry detergent, which will knock off the mortar smears from tuck pointing campaigns that have occurred, or there are restoration cleaners which will take off organic compounds like you know, some moss that's growing, or some other organic compounds or sludge that's occurred over the last 70 or 100 years on your building. So there are chemicals, and typically power washing, as long as you're using the right tip and the right distance from the face of the brick, will be effective as long as you allow the chemicals to dwell on the face of the brick. We would always recommend that you pre-wet any area that you do not want to have the detergents affect. So like, for example, aluminum, if you, aluminum and glass, specifically, a lot of chemicals can potentially burn or etch those materials. So you'd want to pre-wet any areas that you're concerned with, and visqueen or plastic wrap off, you know, a car or anything that's nearby. You want to make sure that you protect that really well. So I can drop links to different chemicals in the response email.
Yeah, I know Prosoco, we've had another speaker say he trusts as well. Yeah, that would be wonderful if you could do that too. But if you know, if those contractors that you're going to mention, the subcontractors that we're going to include in the follow-up, would they also be able to do things like power washing? Because it is kind of, I know there's different PSI recommendations for how strong the water, you know, it can get a little bit complicated. So I'm sure if people can afford to do it and hire somebody, they might. So yeah, if you know folks like that as well, feel free to include those too, please, Brent. And do you think, is that the same in terms of removing rust from brick?
There'll be specific chemicals that will take ferrous metals off of an existing clay or shale brick. So for example, there's graffiti removers, there's stripper creams that you specifically kind of slurry all over the face of the brick. You let it dwell for 5 to 15 minutes, and then you either scrape it off or power wash it off. But there are chemicals that do different things. So ferrous metals, for example, that might be a different chemical than trying to remove you know, moss from your brick. So yeah, there's different product you can use.
Okay. Okay, if a previous or bad repointing job has caused spalling, can the brick be salvaged?
Low probability would be the nice way to respond to that. If the base is popping off of your brick, it's probably received a good bit of water. And what you need to identify is, where is the moisture coming from? If you've perhaps closed cell foamed the inside of your bungalow in order to try to help with your energy consumption, you may have actually exacerbated or sped up the damage that's occurring to your brick. So you can't necessarily just replace a brick and think you've stopped the problem. It might be a more serious situation than just, 20 years the face of the brick fell off ago. But so again, a mason subcontractor who's qualified can probably determine that. And there is quite a bit of building science that goes into determining where the moisture is coming from and how to stop it from progressing.
Jean mentioned here, there's this old house segment on repointing. I just want to mention, we actually have, we did a video series on how to properly repoint with
Cool.
fourth generation owner of a place that, I'm sure you guys probably know, Henry Efflorescence. So, so folks can check that out on our website as well. There is an art to it a little bit, and I know that Brent went over it as well. So we also have a home maintenance 101 guide that gives some basic rules around that as well. So just so you guys know, we have some of those resources additionally on our site. Okay. And can you clarify the difference between tuck pointing and repointing?
Sure. So tuck pointing is a pretty generic term that just essentially means that you're putting new mortar over old mortar in the joints that occur between the bricks. So just a nomenclature comment that I'd like to make. There's a difference between grout and mortar. Grout is for tile what mortar is for brick. So by that, I mean, the only grout you would use in masonry actually gets dumped into the concrete masonry unit or your CMU cinder block. And that essentially is a type S mortar, essentially with aggregates in it. So it'll have big chunks of rocks inside of it. So mortar, which is type S, type N, type O, lime putty mortar, once the grinding occurs, which means the mason subcontractor is actually grinding out the joint of the existing mortar, that can then be pointed. So pointing is not analogous, but often confused with grinding, tuck pointing, and the terms aren't necessarily interchangeable. They do specifically mean different tasks.
And that's a great point too about grinding out the joints, because so much of the repointing that I feel like you see if you're walking along any sort of, the side of any building along Chicago Common Wall is they just sort of stick the mortar on top of the old, joint without actually grinding stuff out first before they put the new mortar in, which is another thing that's not good. So,
Right.
and I believe so in that list of things, that list of different kinds of brick faces that you had up, you did show wire cut brick. We have an attendee asking if they could buy wire cut red brick from you guys over at Bricks Inc. as well.
So wire cut might be something that would be better responded to if you were to send a picture. So some people consider a wire cut where a blade has effectively ripped the face vertically. And some people call that wire cut. Other people call what's vertical scratch, where there's a fine tooth comb that essentially during the extrusion process, as the brick is being squirted out of a pug, what has happened is they're actually dragging a comb across the face. There's light vertical scratch, there's heavy vertical scratch, there's rug. So every manufacturer has its own terminology, but sending us a picture would be really helpful.
Great. And just so folks know, we did have Will Quam actually from Bricks of Chicago do a webinar for us as well. And he did a blog post for us a little while back that kind of breaks some of those down, but also, yes, there's so much variation. So, okay. Okay, I have some old bricks laying around from when I bought the house. They have a small triangle imprint like a maker's mark. Are those Chicago Commons or diamond imprint?
Yeah. I was going to say it's almost 90% chance that it's a diamond instead of a triangle. Yeah, it could have been IBC, it could have been a number of different manufacturers, but the triangle could have been Birch brick, it could have been a bunch of different ones. Chicago Common is a generic term, but there were probably close to 100 manufacturers of Chicago Commons in our market. But that would be very typical to have that stamped on the top of the brick, not necessarily on the face of the brick.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another recommendation for companies to do tuck pointing. Okay, my row home was built in 1890. I've had several tuck pointers tell me that they are not able to match the brick on the front of my home. Is Bricks Inc. able to come out and inspect the brick? So again, this would be a thing where they send you an image and you respond and possibly connect them with the subcontractor as well.
Yeah, a lot of times what'll happen, like on the Roby house, for example, that's a Roman sized brick. So it's an inch and 5/8 tall and 11 and 5/8 long. So in that instance, what we did is we supplied a brick that was actually taller, and the mason subcontractor was actually able to rip the brick down to the height that was required because the manufacturer that had a great color and texture match did not make the right size. So in instances where you have, say, an 8 1/4 inch long brick, sometimes what we'll do is we'll sell the customer an 11 and 5/8 brick because that's the next biggest size without going smaller. And then the mason subcontractor would set up their wet saw, chop the brick at 8 1/4 in order to make it happen. Because what happens if you tooth in a brick that is smaller than the original is your joints get super fat and it looks terrible. So either you break the bond pattern by not staying on the bond that was occurring on the original facade, or you take a brick that's longer, taller, whatever the case might be, and you trim it down to the right size. Now, from a cost-effective standpoint, not the most cost-effective to have to chop all your bricks to a certain height or length, but that might be your only solution if you want it done correctly. So to answer your question, picture from 2 feet away and 10 feet away, that gives us a pretty good idea of what to start with. And then certainly the depth, height, and length are very critical for us to understand what you're trying to achieve.
This is a big question, a broad question, but there's plenty to sort of take apart with it. And just to warn people, we're wrapping up at 7 tonight, so we're going to get through as many of these as we can. Some of them are repeats, so we'll try and consolidate that way. Typically, how long does a proper tuck pointing, repointing job take?
So grinding and tuck pointing are different than spot replacement. So for example, if you need to remove a lintel is what supports the masonry above a punched opening. So a window, a door, a garage door, something like that. What ends up happening is the mason subcontractor would have to remove the brick, say 3 to 5 courses above that punched opening. They would have to determine what's happening, perhaps reuse the steel after painting it, scrubbing it down, getting it back to its original format, or perhaps putting in a new steel lintel. It's basically an L-shaped piece of steel that goes above a punched opening. So that would certainly take more time than someone simply grinding out the joints and then, tuck pointing and filling in the mortar. It really depends on the scope and scale of the project. If we're working on a project and they have to tear down a 4-foot tall parapet around the Chicago Public School, it could take 3 or 4 months. If you're replacing the 2 sidewalls that walk up your bungalow to your front landing, that could be 3-4 days with 4 or 5 guys doing the work. So it totally depends on the scope and scale of your work.
And yeah, the spot pointing is also important. I think sometimes people think they have to have their entire home repointed all at once, versus if they have bug holes, like little, areas as well, can save them a lot of money and time. Several people here have asked about, they have basements that have been painted. And I think there's just sort of a general concern about what to do, interior walls in their basements. Do you deal with that a lot? And what do you see with that?
Again, it's moisture. So if moisture is entering that masonry assembly, if you've painted that, what's happened is you've blocked moisture from coming in as though it would have. So as buildings get tighter and tighter, we have air exchanges, we have ERVs, we have different methods of cycling moisture in and out of the building. So the tighter the wall assembly, while you would think it's good, on these old buildings that were typically drafty and had the ability to breathe, it's not necessarily the best. So removing the paint in the basement might be something you would consider. But oftentimes you've got, I know on my personal home, there were 5 coats of paint on the interior, so there was no getting it off. And based upon what the foundation is made out of, like my rear entry into the basement, which was made into an apartment right after World War II, that whole area was stone instead of a poured concrete foundation. So I take in a lot of water in that area, and I actually did drain tile around the interior perimeter just to make sure I could get the moisture out when it eventually takes on water. So to answer your question, no job is cut and dried where I would say for sure take the paint off, but paint's not doing you any favors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's parging. There's another question about parging on the inside in the basement. And same deal. Let's see. When common brick is tuck pointed, should the mortar be flush with the brick or struck?
Best practice is a concave joint, a grapevine joint, which is very East Coast style, where you have a little V in the joint. Those are the two in terms of shedding water that do the best. But if you look at any sidewall of a Chicago common around the city, if it's in good shape, the majority of them have a flush cut, where essentially the mortar has just been scraped off with the edge of the trowel. And then typically they would use a burlap bag or a piece of carpet to just kind of smear it over the face of the brick. And that was very typical. Again, common brick was a commodity. So the bricklayer would really bang out as much square footage as was possible a day. And there wasn't as much thought as what's called a face brick, which typically is, say, the first 3 foot of a return on a house, the whole facade, and then 3 feet of return. So unless you live on a block where you're at the corner and you can see multiple sides of the building, oftentimes commons were just the cheap part of the house.
Okay, somebody brought up here, Delina, that her chimney is spalling, and she just says my chimney is spalling. But I think there really is the question. It's why is my chimney spalling? Which is, chimneys are a huge problem for bungalow owners, and can be actually extremely dangerous. They start leaning as well. So could you just talk about that for a minute?
Sure. So the main reason for spalling moisture infiltration is a chimney cap that perhaps doesn't have through wall flashing, where the mason subcontractor, the general contractor, whenever that was built, they essentially capped off the top of the chimney and then just poured concrete around the top of it. There may or may not be a spark arrestor or a chimney pot, something else at the top of the chimney. But basically what's happening is moisture hits the top of that chimney or the parapet or whatever the condition is, and it's sucking in water. So if it doesn't have a way to shed it, or, most bungalows were built in the teens to the 30s. So, that's kind of the life cycle if it doesn't have through wall flashing and the proper methods of managing the moisture. So downspouts, scuppers, chimneys, the 2 perpendicular walls to your front entry sequence, those are the areas that typically take on the brunt of the moisture. And guess what? They're gonna have the most problems. Planter boxes too. If you've got, a hardscape component that's made out of brick, that's also an area where we see a lot of deterioration. So stop the water and you're going to stop the problem, but you're also 100 years into the life cycle of the house.
Right. Okay, we'll do 1 or 2 more. This is again, a very big question, but if there's some way to break it down, because I'm sure it's on many people's minds, what does a ballpoint cost for a typical Chicago bungalow to repoint it?
I don't even know how to answer that.
See, like rebuilding those wing walls, in the beginning, those walls that go up to the front door is a really common thing that we have, that we deal with regularly, or chimney rebuilds, if there's some way to break that down a little bit.
I can tell you what the materials cost, and that's about maybe a third of what the actual cost of doing your project would be.
Okay.
So for example, if your brick on average costs $8 to $10 a square foot. That's a generic number. So imagine what the cost is to do that. The other thing that I can't address today on the call is demo. So you're going to have to demo and remove those 2 wing walls. So that's something that the mason subcontractor will potentially have to either rent a 10 or 15 yard dumpster. That's $500 right there. Proper permitting. So I know I'm not trying to evade your question, but
no, it's a big one. That's why, but it's helpful, I think, just to bring up things like that for people to think about and consider. And if we could talk, I guess let's just end. I know that we can't get to quite all of these questions. Some of them are repeated. Some of them, if you go back and rewatch, I know that they're going to be answered as well. And again, go to our website and check out our masonry video series on repointing. we explain a lot of stuff in there, and also in our home maintenance 101 guide. Check that out on our website at www.chicagobungalow.org. What was I going to ask now? I had one final question that I thought could be kind of a good wrap up. People again are just, how do we, if people want to contact you, to contact Bricks Inc., and they're concerned about matching their brick, they take a picture 2 feet away, they take a picture 10 feet away, and they can just email those to you and see if you have the brick available. Is that the best way to do it?
Yeah, that's a great start. Right off our website, there's a 773 number. Feel free to call. I would say, honestly, if you could send images, that's the best way to start. We won't be able to tell everything from the image, but if you've got cracked bricks, you can see that over the window, there's a crack occurring at, say, 45 to 35 degrees. We can pretty much tell you that the lintel is spent, there's deflection. Again, these are things that we only do the material supply, so we'd stop short of saying, hey, you need to do X, Y, Z, but we can tell you what's probably happening there. And then having a mason subcontractor, get 2 or 3 bids, because that's the only way you're going to know if the guy that came in at 1,000 is a tenth of the cost of the other 2. And it's not to say that the other 2 are trying to pull a fast one on the homeowner, but typically if you're coming with recommendations and you've got 5, 10, 15 years worth of experience or more, you've seen this situation happen many times in the past. So qualified contractor, I do want to address one from one of the people that threw a comment, Wythe, spelled W-Y-T-H-E. So a Wythe, if you're touching the brick on the outside of your house, that's the first Wythe of brick. The brick that's directly behind it, closer to where you live, that's the second Wythe, and so on, the third Wythe, the fifth Wythe, however many it might be. So from touching the brick, you've got your first Wythe, and as you go in, that's multiple Wythes. So thicknesses of the wall, they're nominally 4 inches. They could be fatter, they could be skinnier, but sorry if I didn't define that clearly enough. But it's a very typical masonry jargon that nobody uses anywhere else. So sorry if I skipped over that too quick.
Yeah, and just so you guys, many of you are Chicago bungalow owners, and Chicago bungalows are all 2 wides. They all have 2 wides around them. So that, you have your outer wall, then there's an actual inner wall with a tiny gap in between those 2 walls. And then you'll have plaster on the inside, or originally had plaster on the inside of that inner wide. So yeah, great question. Again, we're going to send out a follow-up email. Everyone who signed up is going to get that with a link to this, with some recommendations for masonry contractors that are pretty great, and any other information that came up this evening as well. Brent, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Really appreciate your time. Also, you guys can go out and see Bricks Inc. And shop around, I believe. I'm not sure. What are your hours, and what is your website?
It's really tricky, bricksinc.net.
All right.
Yeah, we're open, gates open at 6:30 in the morning, and typically our yard crew leaves at 4. So 6:30 to 4, Saturday by appointment until noon. But yeah, you're totally welcome. I mean, if you can bring a physical brick down to us, we can tell you what you're working with. If you can't, and pictures and dimensions are all you can offer, it's a good starting point. I think Carla, you and I, and the rest of your team, we can kind of have a bullet point summary of most of these inquiries that you need to address. And yeah, we can circulate some information, but our website's pretty solid in terms of the learn page. So there's an area where you can go on there and find a lot of FAQs that are typical. 2 other items I'd like to drop are the International Masonry Institute. I would Google that. imiweb.org is their website. And BIA, which is the Brick Industry Association. Ton of tech notes, anything you want to know about a brick or masonry assembly, those 2 websites are pretty awesome. So I'll share those with Carla, and you guys can circulate that. That's
great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, really appreciate your time again. Really appreciate everybody else's time. It's a beautiful night. Get outside, go grill something, and we will see you guys soon for our next webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Bye.